The situation remains volatile in the Western Cape as the taxi strike continues. Thousands of commuters were left stranded, vehicles have been petrol bombed and traffic has been gridlocked, causing chaos on Cape Town roads. What is the way forward now? To help us answer this, I'm joined now by Mmatshikhidi Rebecca Phala, National Spokesperson of SANTACO. Thank you so much for your time this evening. We know the situation is still tense. We know that a couple of cars have allegedly been stoned by taxi drivers and operators, and that buses have been torched. Can you tell us your position on that? We know that you do not advocate for any of your members to engage in violence, and yet we see so much violence happening.
Sure. Good evening, and thank you for that preamble. It sums up our position. We do not promote any violence. We do not encourage it. We do not even encourage our members to partake in any violence. And as you rightly said, it is at this point an allegation that seems to suggest or seem to show that people are suspecting that our members are behind the acts of violence. We have and continue to say we really are in support of law enforcement investigating as and when it is suspected that violence has erupted in any form in South Africa. And that's not different even in this case. When we met yesterday with community members in Khayelitsha, the messaging was clear to say that we're going to pull back our vehicles and find alternative ways that we can engage with the government of the city of Cape Town and in extension the province to try and find ways for them to implement the bylaws without necessarily seeming to be wanting to scratch off completely the operation of taxi vehicles. So it is very regrettable that violence has since emanated as a result of or following what has been decided by our leadership.
I was speaking to MMC for Safety and Security in the city of Cape Town, JP Smith, a little bit earlier, and he said that it's so difficult that when a strike is called and violence takes place immediately, that the leadership and the taxi associations cannot then claim to not have any responsibility for that violence, because if members cannot be controlled and are not part of the understanding of how the strike should take place, then the leadership is somehow to blame and lacking. What do you make of that?
Look, I think the MMC should perhaps appreciate the reality of the country that we live in and some of the circumstances that we often witness, which lead to criminality. I'm sure if one was, for instance, to cite what happened back in July of 2021, you would have seen a decision being taken by a court, and subsequent to that, crazy amounts of violence then sort of coming about as a result of that. And the people who had been at the center of that particular matter were never necessarily said to take responsibility for that, because unfortunately it was an after effect. And so we want such kind of understanding to prevail throughout. Unfortunately, we live in a country where people are aggrieved in varied forms. Yesterday, when the leadership of the Western Cape made this declaration to say we'll be pulling away our vehicles, community members were there. They shared in the frustrations. And so it will not necessarily be fair for the taxi industry to be suspect number one when police haven't done any investigation work whatsoever to try and get to the bottom of this. Wanting to sort of entertain thoughts of who thinks who is responsible for what might prove to be futile and not necessarily help. Criminality is wrong and it needs to be brought to book as and when it is found. Law enforcement should be encouraged and supported to do their work. We do not take responsibility for the results of the violence. We condemn them. And we also wish to say to our commuters, we are very sorry that they are at the receiving end of this unfortunate happening.
So as you put it, the commuters are the ones carrying the biggest brunt, the impact of this strike. What is the way forward to try and get things back to normality as soon as possible, to do away with the violence, to get the commuters back on track in terms of getting to work? We know it is weekend, but lots of people still work on weekends and need to get to places. How do we move forward?
Look, in keeping with what we said at the tail end of that engagement we had with community members yesterday, since yesterday, the leadership of SANTACO in the Western Cape and nationally have been in meetings with varied stakeholders, inclusive of government, all in effort to find a resolution to this. Obviously, none of the meetings have already been concluded, hence we haven't released any statement and would not be in a position to communicate as of yet what will happen moving forward. But people should rest assured that we're not just folding our arms and we're not purposefully deciding to frustrate the commuters who, by the way, are also sustaining the livelihoods of us as operators in our families. So we are all in talks now, all in hopes of finding some commonality so that we can resume operations as soon as possible.
I'm sure you've gauged the sentiment from your members. I know, just going back to the Safety and Security MMC, JP Smith, he said that for every truck or bus or vehicle that is stoned or burnt or property that is damaged, the city will impound 25 further taxis. What do you think would be the reaction from your members if that were to be carried out?
Look, we want to first say that statement is very shocking to be said, but I think it also goes to show that what we've been suspecting might just have some authenticity to it. If a leader says that they're going to impound that number of vehicles solely if there is any emanation of violence, that for us is very concerning. How our members would react if that were to happen, obviously we wouldn't want to presuppose what could or would happen. However, obviously there is a lot of frustration, and I think that's one of the reasons why, as soon as we realized that the impounding is not necessarily happening because the city wants to ensure that there's compliance in the industry, but there appears to be a concerted effort to try and do something a bit bigger towards the industry. So we don't anticipate any retaliation that would further cause problems in the country. We hope that as a government, they also will not act on that very reckless statement because it is concerning and would have dire effects. What we want is to have proper engagement with government, for them to tell us, for starters, why is it that they are impounding our vehicles, citing reasons whose offense is often on the side of drivers, and in some instances, not as major as they make it to seem out to be. But more than anything, we want to come out of the engagement with clarity of how do we resume forth, because ordinary South Africans are unfortunately at the receiving end of this.
Thank you so much for your time and for speaking to us. That was Mmatshikhidi Rebecca Phala, National Spokesperson of SANTACO, giving us their take on the continuing strike in the taxi industry there.